With my most anticipated game of 2024 being Dragon's Dogma 2, I still thought Banishers looked right up my alley, so I decided to pick it up right after launch. Playing through it, it hit some amazing highs and some tragic lows. So where did it land when I finally rolled credits? Well, let's get into it.
It's behind me, isn't it?
Yes.
Of course it is. Every bloody time.
Welcome back to JBG. Today we're talking about Banishers Ghost of New Eden on PS5. Banishers is a third-person narrative-driven action-adventure game from Don't Nod Studios. Don't Nod is the studio behind the well-known Life is Strange and the lesser-known Vampire. The studio is known for its choice-driven narratives and consequence systems in their games, and Banishers isn't an exception. As usual, I'm going to avoid major spoilers outside of the story setup, and most of that's going to be content already shown in the trailers. But there will be some small contextual spoilers in the footage as I talk about a couple things. So Banishers is set in the late 17th century and follows our protagonists, Red and Antea. They're professional banishers that go around investigating haunting cases and ultimately forcing the ghosts to move on to the afterlife.
Life to the living.
Death to the dead.
The game opens up with them arriving in the Boston area to a town called New Eden at the request of a fellow banisher and an old friend of theirs, Charles. Upon arriving, they learn that the spirit is much stronger than initially expected and has already killed Charles. Still underestimating this spirit, dubbed a nightmare, Antea ends up being killed and haunting Red, who somehow survived the encounter, being brought back to shore near a smaller settlement. The path back to New Eden isn't accessible anymore, and you aren't powerful enough to confront the nightmare right away. So the main story arc is finding a way back to New Eden and ultimately deciding if you're going to banish Antea's ghost or resurrect her at the expense of sacrificing innocent lives to do so. This decision of whether to banish or resurrect Antea comes into account for all the hauntings you investigate through the smaller settlements you're passing through on your way back to New Eden, and your choices echo in the overall narrative itself. Before I go into the game mechanics though, my quick shameless plug. This video is sponsored by my day job. All views and opinions are my own. Likes and subs are appreciated, but don't hit the notification button. Does anybody actually even do that? Seems annoying. Don't do that. So the bulk of the game revolves around investigating the hauntings on your path back to New Eden and combating ghosts along the way. Through the main quest, Red gains experience for progression, and Antea gains experience through the side quests, basically the optional side hauntings. I hesitate to call it a skill tree for progression, because outside of the expansion of trees as Antea gains most of her abilities at story intervals, there's only a couple of melee combo expansions, and the rest are mostly stat boosts or perks with an offset nerf. It definitely allows you to spec into a build, but it isn't exactly opening too many skills themselves, just how you decide to focus on them. The map itself opens up through the main quest lines, and has a bunch of areas locked off to you until you gain the skill to get past certain obstacles. This is meant to give it a Metroidvania feel, and it doesn't exactly land the way it intended, but I'll go more into that in the pro-con section. The map is essentially an open corridor world, with a handful of slightly larger areas with branching paths. Quests are marked on your map at story intervals, and icons for side activities like specter locations and locked chests show as question marks until exploring close enough to populate the map with the exact icon. Combat consists primarily of melee options, with it expanding as the story goes on, eventually opening up the rifle for Red and more combat options for Antea that are more spell-based cooldown mechanics. Obviously, the camera placement is a closer third-person view than most action games. It seems heavily influenced by the recent God of War games in the combat view and the traversal mechanics. The selling point mechanic here is the on-demand switching between Red and Antea in real time. Red is meant to deal more damage to the spirits and specters, and Antea meant to deal more damage to physical enemies like possessed corpses. This will vary depending on how you spec into the build, but initially this is how it operates. Red has his own health bar, and Antea's health bar is increased through damage that Red does. Antea's health bar is also reduced through actions in combat, so it's meant to be a balancing act between the two characters in combat depending on the situation. Outside of combat, you can freely switch between the two, and this is how you use Antea's spectral vision, where most of the haunting investigation is done. This is a heavy choice and consequence focus that does end up impacting characters as the story goes. It's where you decide if you're going to sacrifice the living to resurrect Antea, or send them to the afterlife to support ascending Antea's ghost. There are two separate options of dealing with the ghost too, being ascending or banishing being a more painful way and ascending being a more peaceful way, but this has some story implications too, so I won't explain it too much further than that. The gear you acquire through the game is more of a mechanic to spec into a playstyle than anything definitively better as you go. Basically different stat boosts that you raise through upgrading the gear. With the limited amount of later upgrade components, it does end up being a pretty early commitment to a build, unless you decide to do some grinding later on. Speccing into a strength build from the start meant I wore the same basic gear throughout most of the game, and only swapped it if there ended up being a more strength-focused item later. This isn't necessarily a negative since it gives you the options on how to spec out your character, just something to keep in mind if you decide to level your gear past the first or second upgrade. An overall impression on the achievement front, this game will be a grind for completionists. The main reason being, there isn't much of a way to circumvent the main story trophies of ascending or resurrecting Antea, and you have to finish every side quest haunting scenario, at least for one playthrough. There is some room to deviate from the initial decision you make, but I'm not sure to the extent it goes after the game prompts you a second time to make a promise to Antea. There's also a couple combat related trophies, but none of these were really too grindy if you focused on getting them, especially later in the game. I would assume you could streamline a second playthrough if you really wanted to, but no, this is not a short game, even streamlining it. I ended up with just over 40 hours, and I skipped quite a bit of the endgame side quests. I'll get to why in a minute, but just know this isn't going to be a short 100% if you're a completionist. So going into the pros and cons, I'm going to separate them here for a change because this is such a polarizing game for me to talk about. It goes pretty far in both directions. So let's start out with the pros. First off, this is another AA game, so I don't hold it to the same standards as a AAA or even a quadruple A game. That said, overall, Banishers is a great looking game. From the environment to the character models, AA games are looking better every year. I was even surprised how expressive some of the character models are. The lip sync is admittedly bad, especially in the first few hours. But if I can get through 120 hours of Elden Ring, and FromSoft never seems to get any flack for never putting any effort into lip syncing, I'm not going to be overly critical of it.
How long will it be, I wonder, before the tarnished tire of obeisance to the two fingers?
It's only slightly distracting. And though I wouldn't call this a horror game by any means, there's some great moments that get under your skin. The entire setup of the boss shown in the trailer being one of the best in my opinion. And there's several side stories that border on the horror genre too. The overall tone and writing here is phenomenal. The side quests mostly boil down to smaller haunting stories, but these are genuinely interesting, and most are extremely well written. This goes hand in hand with the great voice actors' performances. This is a AAA level all the way through the game. Hands down one of the better performances I've seen lately. While I see a general consensus that Red is a great protagonist,
You didn't ask me here to watch you drink soup. What do you want?
I didn't dislike Antea as much as I've seen a lot of other people talk about. I actually find it more believable in this setting.
Perhaps she resented playing the messenger. Perhaps she just wanted to make you late.
Antea being a more experienced Banisher, she's a bit more cold on the job and the scenarios in general. Red being a newer Banisher still has a lot of positive outlook on things he's going into. Even their couple dynamic makes complete sense to me. I think we all know a couple or two exactly like this. Red being a bit more of a goofball, Antea being much more direct and reserved, still having that dry sense of humor that shows through though. And outside of a very small amount of narrative choices, they complement each other great here. The characters and stories throughout the game are all extremely well done. That's gotta be the strongest point of the game.
Are you ready for the ritual?
No, but let's do it anyway.
On top of the side quests being just as good as the main story arcs, there are even follow-up quests after the side missions. These are just as optional, but it gives a bit deeper look into what happens after you wrap up the side quests. I can't stress enough how the writing and acting is going to carry this game. It might just be the factor that gets you through to see the credits when the flaws start to really show up later in the game. The first one is the combat. I wouldn't go so far to call it bad, but it's not good. They try and mirror God of War really closely here with the general movement and mechanics. But it eventually falls apart and not even directly due to the combat flaws themselves. The lock-on during gank fights is the first issue. Here you have the same type POV that you do in God of War, but you don't have anything in terms of crowd control. You get the same damage indicators telling you when you're about to take damage, but since you're generally going to be targeting one specific enemy at a time and trying to hit a specific window for attack, you stress the timing here more than you would in God of War. Also, the auto-lock doesn't work as well as you would expect, sometimes just completely losing lock and not redirecting as you would expect it. You have the ability to make a 180 turn, but that goes into another issue. The turn is tied to the down directional button. You can call this user error if you want to, but you aren't using any other directional button during combat. Now in God of War, that's how you're changing your weapons. Also, the tempo of combat just seems a little bit off. Here it gets much more chaotic with some enemies having very small windows to react and almost no tell on their attack. This ended up being a minor gripe once I got used to it, but it was just the start of the issues. The second one being, once you enter combat, you have to finish it. There is no losing aggro and just moving on. You're physically tied to that encounter because none of the traversal prompts will populate while you're in combat. This was another one I only considered a small issue after I first tested it. It didn't bug me too much, until it did. This ties directly into traversal and what I think is the biggest gripe all around for anyone that can get used to the way the rest of the combat's paced. There's a specific area that a side quest marker leads you deep into a mine. You have to wait on a painfully slow lift to come down to get on. Then you have to go all the way back up to the top. Knowing it's going to be the exact same weight going up to the top, I took a pot shot at an enemy out of boredom. This led me to reach the top completely hardlocked out of any progression. There's no traversal prompt in combat, so I couldn't use the lift, and I couldn't leave the building, and there was no drop of aggro, so I had to reload the last autosave. Even the save being at the bottom of the lift, I had to wait for it to come all the way back down again, and write it all the way back up, only to find out I simply had to take the second lift in that same room at the top to go down to the same specter I had just shot that hardlocked my game. This is a major design flaw and one I overlooked up to that point until I had had enough of the traversal in general. The world here tries to mimic how God of War works, but misses some major points. Where God of War has a few areas with shimmy mechanics, they overuse this mechanic in every single area.
And up and down we go.
God of War also has some open areas, like the Lake of the Nines, where here you just have corridors and wider corridors. There's not much exploration to do until endgame because of roadblocks, and the way these corridors wrap over each other, the only direct connections means you have to traverse the entire area with no exception. I'm not exaggerating when I say even with fast travel, you'll spend up to 10 minutes at a time with breaks and sprinting just to shimmy between some rocks every time you try and backtrack through the map. I had to take multiple breaks while playing just to sit it down for a little bit because I was getting so tired of just walking through section after section. And after being forced to fight the exact same 6 enemies or so from the beginning of the game up until the end with very few changes outside of bosses, the forced combat along with the tedious nature of getting from one area to another just to hit a breaking point in the lift section, it made me just streamline it. I'm no game dev, so I'm not sure how hard it would be to patch the forced combat section and let you just pass through it, but this wouldn't fix the issue with the repetitive combat that was already there. Though I don't think it feels quite as bad as some people say, it takes a long time for it to really open up. Those two, the combat and traversal decisions, are what really brought this game down that I loved up until about hour 30. And if a game was ever in need of New Game Plus, it's a game that you got so annoyed with the mechanics in the end, but still had so much more story to tell. Without a New Game Plus, you have to slog your way through the entire first half with none of the combat options that actually started making the combat more fun, just to see the other side of all the amazing choice-related options throughout the entire game. Lastly, with the overall great storytelling and writing here, there was some really heavy-handed cringe dialogue inserted late game. It's glossed over almost just as suddenly as it pops up, but there were a couple really out-of-place wording and tone issues with Antea that didn't match anything else to that point, or after. It almost brought down how good of a fit I really thought Red was with Antea, but it disappearing so quick makes me think it was just a budgetary issue of not being able to go back and rework what they already had. Now I know this really sounds like I'm shitting all over this game, and as much as it comes off that way, I really liked it overall. It's an amazing game held back by some design choices I just can't even wrap my head around. And I'm probably going to go back to it after giving it some time, probably a year or so, because I do want to see the other side of the story options. So that brings me to the price point recommendation. Up until the 30-hour mark, I would have really said this was completely worth a $60 price tag. Even with the slow development of combat and the lack of enemy variety, I was completely invested in the main story and every one of the side quests. But once the cracks started showing, they really started showing. And the horribly repetitive and tedious nature of the endgame traversal and the combat tied so closely, it's what makes it repetitive. I'd honestly put the price point recommendation closer to the $30 mark, because you're still getting quite a bit of game here. But that's only if you think you can power through the repetitive endgame, or at least give it enough breaks to get through it all. There's a lot of game to love here, and a ton of solid content in isolation. Great writing propped up by great voice acting and direction, an immersive world with a great setting, an overall great looking AA game. It just fell apart so bad at the end mechanically that I'm not sure any amount of patching can completely cover it, though a New Game Plus mode will work wonders for any thoughts of playing through it all again. Let me know down in the comments if you played through Banishers already and what you thought of it. Until next time.
Go in peace.
What? Toodaloo, motherfucker. Hey.